On the night the Titanic began to sink, almost everyone thought about escaping, climbing higher, or trying to reach a lifeboat. But one couple did the opposite. Instead of following the crowd, they went back to their own cabin and shut the door. It sounds impossible, right? But this story is not just about the sinking itself. It is about what was happening outside that room while the ship slipped toward its end. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and come with me to the center of this mystery. At first, Titanic did not look like a doomed ship. The corridors still looked immaculate, the cabins stayed warm, the lounges still held their air of order, and normal life survived in details too small to feel historic. That is a point many people overlook. The disaster did not begin with screams or instant collapse. It began with a false sense of continuity, and that changes everything. Because when the environment still feels comfortable, the human mind is slow to accept urgency. You look at that setting and think, who would truly believe the end had already begun inside those walls? The real impact was not the head-on collision that so many dramatizations repeated for years. What happened was quieter on the outside and far more serious within. A glancing scrape along the ice, enough to damage the hull without creating, right away, the obvious image of destruction most people would expect. Up in the crow's nest, the lookouts worked without binoculars, and the danger was recognized too late. On the bridge, the reaction was fast, but time was already running out. That is what makes this kind of tragedy so chilling. It starts without looking big, but once the water finds the right path, it is already over. While the lounges, staircases, and corridors still looked almost normal, the real disaster was already growing below the waterline. Compartments were beginning to flood, engineering spaces were operating under a completely different reality, and the crew understood before the passengers that this was not some passing inconvenience. The ship had already split into different worlds. Above, doubt. Below, calculation. Above, appearance. Below, structural failure. And that hits hard, because it shows how great tragedies do not always arrive with spectacle. Sometimes they arrive in silence, spreading through places most people never see, until it is far too late. Now look at the cabin more carefully, not as just another setting, but as a central piece of this choice. There was warmth there, privacy, personal belongings, a certain feeling of control. In extreme situations, human beings do not run on instinct alone. They also try to hold on to the last space that still feels understandable. And in that moment, that room may have looked exactly like that. A pause, a refuge. A place to wait, put on something better, think clearly, observe before acting. The problem is that the ship's time no longer obeyed the time of that room. Titanic was already getting worse, even while the cabin still pretended everything was normal. This couple has to be understood within Titanic's social world, not as two characters dropped into a disaster, but as people shaped by age, class, posture, and the idea of dignity that came with that kind of environment. There was a way to occupy space, to react in public, to keep composure even under pressure. That matters more than it seems. In extreme moments, people do not act out of fear alone. They also act according to everything they spent a lifetime learning about what is acceptable, proper, or shameful. And maybe that is one key to this story. Their decision may have begun long before that night. On the bridge, the early morning had already become something else. The atmosphere was still disciplined, cold, technical, but the logic had changed completely. There, Titanic stopped being a floating palace and became what it truly was, a giant machine trying to answer for a mistake that could no longer be undone. The ocean outside remained dark, calm, almost indifferent, and that sends a strange chill through you, because appearances still helped hide the size of the problem. While many passengers were still dealing with uncertainty, the men in command were already facing a harsher truth. The ship was still beautiful, the ship was still lit up, but the ship was already lost. In the corridors, the change did not arrive as a rupture, it arrived as a shift. Doors began opening more often. Passengers stepped out without knowing whether this was only a precaution or the beginning of an evacuation. Crew members repeated instructions, but not everyone read the danger the same way. Titanic still preserved her elegance, only now it was crossed by something else. Direction. People were no longer just moving around. They were starting to head upward. And that says a lot. When an entire ship begins to reorganize the flow of human movement, routine is already over. The beauty of the corridor is still there, but its purpose has changed. Now it is a passage toward survival. Reaching the deck did not mean understanding everything. That is one detail many people erase when they reduce Titanic to panic and escape. There was hesitation, there was disbelief. There were people looking out at the dark sea and thinking that staying on the ship still seemed safer. It sounds absurd today, but in that moment the logic was not so simple. Titanic still looked too steady, too brightly lit, too immense to convince everyone of her own death sentence. And it is precisely in that gap between appearance and reality that irreversible choices begin to emerge. The boat deck was not only the place of salvation, it was also the place of doubt, delay, and fatal misreadings. This is where the story truly changes. The couple has seen enough movement to realize something serious is happening, but they do not react like the crowd around them. Instead of speeding up, they slow down. Instead of following the flow, they stop. It is that moment when the decision happens inside before it shows itself outside. And that matters far more than any theatrical gesture, because the choice does not begin when the door closes. It begins when going upward stops being the only possible direction in their minds. It is a quiet point, almost invisible, but decisive. And maybe that is exactly why this story is so unsettling. It does not explode, it defines itself in silence. And then comes the strangest act in this entire reconstruction. They go back. They go back against the human flow, against the logic of the deck, against the belief that haste might still save them. While the corridor is carrying people upward, this couple chooses to return to the only space that still holds some appearance of order. This is where the video begins to deliver on its promise with full force. We are not just looking at a sinking. We are looking at the human map of that decision, so stay with me to the end, because the question is no longer just what happened to the ship. The question has become something else. Why did that room begin to feel, to them, like the right place to wait? Outside that cabin, Titanic was not standing still for a single second. The wireless room was working against the clock, the boat deck demanded hard choices, and command could no longer afford the luxury of doubt. Inside the room, though, time seemed to move at a different speed. And that contrast is brutal, because it makes one thing clear: the choice to stay did not happen outside reality. It happened while the rest of the ship moved with growing urgency. One part of the vessel was trying to save whatever could still be saved. Another part was trying to understand. And in the middle of it all, the cabin was already beginning to separate itself from the rest of Titanic as if it were another world. Here the cabin stops being just a setting and becomes the absolute center of the narrative. The corridor still exists, the boats are still being lowered, the crew is still moving, but inside that room the feeling is different. The objects are still in place, the light is still warm, the space still feels domestic, almost normal. Except that normality is now a fragile lie, and maybe that is what disturbs us most about this story. The end may not have arrived there with immediate noise, but with stillness, with suspended time, with the illusion that the world can still fit inside a neat little room, even while the rest of the ship has already started collapsing from within. The main question here is not whether they heard some specific sound or saw someone run down the corridor. The more serious question is this: how much had they already understood? And to be honest, it is possible they understood more than it seems. When the movement of people changes, when the behavior of the crew changes, when the ship itself starts responding differently, a lot becomes readable, even without formal explanation. Maybe they did not know every technical detail? Maybe they could not imagine the exact sequence of the sinking, but maybe they already knew enough to realize this was not leading back to normal life. Sometimes the body understands before language does. One of the strongest possibilities is simple, harsh, and deeply human. They did not want to be separated. And this has to be handled carefully, without over-romanticizing it. We are not talking about an idealized scene. We are talking about the real possibility that, in an uneven evacuation filled with confusion and uncertainty, staying together may have felt more acceptable than gambling on a slim chance of individual survival. That changes the reading of the story quite a bit. Because the cabin stops being just a physical space and becomes the only place where the two of them still controlled anything at all. Not the ship, not the sea, not fate, just each other's company. And sometimes that is everything. There is another point that almost never gets the weight it deserves. Not every extreme decision is born from panic. Some are born from lucidity. There may have been a clear-eyed reading of the situation, an honest awareness of age, physical limits, the real odds of escape, the very real difficulty of fighting for space in a night already sliding into chaos. It may have been less about hope and more about understanding. And that hurts in a different way, because it forces us to let go of the easy idea that every person fights until the final second. Not always. Sometimes a person stops because the math has already been done inside. Sometimes the quietest gesture is also the most conscious one. On Titanic, behavior was also culture. Class, age, public image, and the notion of dignity were not just background details. They were part of the mental structure through which many people moved through the world. In moments like these, that matters. Maybe this couple did not look at the chaos as a place where they still belonged. Maybe they believed others had priority. Maybe composure, to them, mattered just as much as fear. And that kind of reading helps pull the story away from easy sentimentality. This is not only about emotion, it is also about era, values, social hierarchy, and the way certain people understood what it meant to act properly. While the hull had already been condemned from within, many of the ship's grand spaces still held their beauty. Staircases, corridors, reading rooms, reception spaces, electric light, polished wood, carpets, visual order. All of it remained standing for a while longer, as if Titanic insisted on keeping up appearances until the very end. That completely scrambles any passenger's sense of reality. Because imagine the scene. You are surrounded by elegance, comfort, and apparent stability, yet the ship has already entered a logic of collapse. That contrast is not decorative. It is part of the tragedy. The beauty of the setting delayed acceptance of the danger. In that moment, luxury was deceiving too. From this point on, the logic of the room changes completely. The space is still the same, but it no longer means the same thing. What once looked like refuge begins to feel like enclosure. Small physical signs appear and become harder to ignore. The altered angle, the shifting shadows, objects no longer feeling neutral, balance demanding attention. This is not a theatrical transition, it is worse than that. It is slow, it is physical. It is the moment when the familiar starts failing from within without immediately losing its domestic appearance. And that creates a deeply uncomfortable feeling because the place chosen for waiting begins to reveal that it will give way right along with the ship. Here the choice stops being merely symbolic and begins confronting the ship's physical reality head-on. Titanic is no longer just an emergency, she is changing behavior. structure begins to speak louder, the tilt increases, movement inside the ship stops being a social issue and becomes a mechanical one. From this point on, the cabin is not only isolated from the rest, it is being dragged into the same reality that has already overtaken stairways, corridors, decks, and engineering spaces. And that prepares the ground for the phase in which class, luxury, and privacy will no longer matter at all. The ship is ceasing to be a human setting. It is becoming nothing but mass, angle, steel, and water. From here on out, the room changes function for good. What once looked like protection begins to behave like a trap. The signs do not have to be huge to be devastating. A glass slides, a line tilts, a piece of furniture shifts in a new way, the body feels the floor differently underfoot. This is the point where the choice takes on a different weight, because staying there stops being only an emotional, moral, or intimate decision. It becomes a decision made inside a space that has already started failing along with the ship. And that is brutal, because it shows how the last possible refuge can turn, without warning, into the very limit of escape. Now the tragedy becomes too physical for any illusion to survive. The bow drops, the deck responds, bodies have to adjust to the angle, and Titanic no longer feels like a place governed only by human orders. Command still exists, the crew is still working, but the structure has taken control of the night. From this point on, engineering imposes its own narrative, and that matters to this story because the couple is no longer simply waiting. They are trapped inside the same logic, dragging the whole ship downward. The room is no longer a world apart. It is one cell in a total collapse, only seen from the inside. This is the point where Titanic's larger story fully crashes through the smaller story of the cabin. The sequence matters. The bow sinks first, the ship breaks apart, and then the stern faces its own descent. That matters because the power of this reconstruction depends on staying faithful to what truly happened. We are not just watching the end of an ocean liner. We are watching the moment when every interior space loses its meaning at once. Lounges, corridors, engineering spaces, deck, luxury cabin, everything becomes part of the same colossal failure. The breakup erases the boundaries between environments, and from that point on, Titanic stops being a ship and becomes wreckage in the making. When the structure enters collapse, there is no longer any protected interior. The cabin stops being a room, the door stops being a boundary, objects stop being domestic. This may be the harshest part of the entire reconstruction. Realizing that the final space chosen by the couple is also destroyed by the same ship that made that space possible in the first place. The room does not remain. The room is overcome. And yet the decision made there remains one of the strongest images in the entire tragedy. Because even if the environment disappears, the human act does not vanish with it, the space is gone. The question remains, and that is what makes this story endure. More than a century later, Titanic still rests on the floor of the Atlantic as both material evidence and an open question. The bow remains recognizable, parts of the structure still help reconstruct routes, spaces, and contrasts aboard that ship, and modern exploration sheds light on fragments that survived time, pressure, and corrosion. But the seafloor does not give everything back. It preserves and erases at the same time. It reveals and conceals in equal measure. And that is essential to understanding this video, because archaeology can bring us closer to the setting, the geography, the physical matter of the disaster. What it cannot do is fully fill the human void left inside that cabin.
What you saw here was a historical reconstruction with AI, based on records from the time, told in a cinematic format.
This is where the narrative has to be honest. We can reconstruct the context, the ship's behavior, the flow of people, the logic of the choice, the look of the interiors, and the progression of the disaster. We can support serious hypotheses, but we cannot say with absolute certainty what happened inside that room in each final minute. And maybe that is exactly what keeps this story alive after all this time. Historically, the cabin exists as a point of controlled imagination, surrounded by clues, limited by evidence, protected by mystery. It is not an invitation to invent, it is an invitation to recognize how far history can reach, and where the ocean still imposes silence. In the end, this is not just a story about Titanic sinking. It is a story about two people who, in the middle of the collapse of one of the most famous ships in history, seem to have chosen to remain where the rest of the ship still pretended to be human. Inside a room, among intimate objects, far from the boat deck and close to silence. Some Titanic stories endured because they speak of struggle, escape, and resistance. This one survives for another reason, because of the decision to wait, because of the choice not to follow the flow, and because of the question that has crossed 113 years without fading away. What was there inside that cabin that made staying feel possible when the rest of the world was already telling them to run?